It was supposed to be a normal Friday evening, just like any other. I had come home from school, tired from the week's workload, and walked into the house to the comforting smells of dinner and the faint hum of the TV in the living room. My dad's laughter echoed through the hall, a sound I was so used to hearing after a long day. Everything was just as it always was, familiar and comforting. But there was something in the air that felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It wasn't the way the house looked or the way my dad was acting. It was the presence of Jared, my dad's best friend, who was sitting in his usual chair in the living room. Jared had been around since I was little, always present at holidays, barbecues, and family get-togethers. He was more like a second father to me than just a friend of my dad's. He had this way about him, calm, composed, and easygoing. I trusted him implicitly, even admired him in a way that went beyond simple friendship. But tonight, there was something unsettling in the way he looked at me. It wasn't a huge difference, just a small shift, an extra moment of eye contact, a lingering smile, the kind of things that could easily be brushed off. Except they couldn't. Not for me. I felt my pulse quicken every time I caught him glancing in my direction. And he wasn't even trying to hide it, which made it even worse. I found myself avoiding his gaze, focusing on the mundane things, the TV, the food on the counter, but it was impossible to ignore the strange tension between us. The more I tried to avoid it, the more obvious it became. I could tell that Jared was aware of it too. The way he held my gaze for a fraction of a second longer when I walked past him, the casual way his hand brushed against my arm as he handed me a drink. It was as if he was testing the waters, seeing how much I would let slide. And I did, too much. Because I couldn't tell if he was being kind, or if he was doing something else. Something more intentional. There had been moments in the past, little things, that I brushed off. A comment here, a brief touch there, things I couldn't fully explain but never questioned at the time. But tonight, there was no denying it. This feeling was too strong, too consuming. I was suddenly hyper-aware of every movement he made, every word he spoke, and the way my heart seemed to race in response. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. Something that would change everything. And when Jared invited me to join him in the kitchen for a drink later, I knew I couldn't refuse. The words slipped out of his mouth with ease, like it was just another ordinary thing, but I could hear the hidden undertone in his voice. It was subtle but clear. This time, it wasn't just another evening with a family friend. This time, everything would change. The moment I walked into that kitchen, I knew I wouldn't be able to forget what happened next. And neither would Jared. The relationship between Jared and me was, at least on the surface, nothing out of the ordinary. He was my dad's best friend, someone who had been in and out of my life for as long as I could remember. They had met in college, both finding a shared love for sports, adventure, and good company, and over the years, their bond had only strengthened. Jared was the type of guy who could get along with anyone, yet I always knew that he had a special place in my family's life. He was dependable, easygoing, and just kind enough to make me feel comfortable around him. My dad often joked about how Jared was like the brother he never had, and over the years, it was a sentiment I grew used to. Growing up, I didn't think much of their friendship. Jared was just always there. He showed up for family birthdays, holidays, or any random weekend barbecue. He always had a way of making me laugh with stories from his past or just teasing me about the new stupid stuff I was doing. He was protective in a subtle, natural way, but I always knew that nothing crossed the line between the friendship he shared with my dad and his role as an older figure in my life. I respected him, and he respected me. Our interactions were normal, nothing that would raise any suspicion or curiosity. But it wasn't always like that. Not in the beginning. I remember in my younger years, how I looked up to Jared. He seemed to have this effortless charm that drew people to him. It wasn't just his looks, though he was tall with dark wavy hair that framed his face in a way that made him seem both laid back and rugged. His charisma came from the way he carried himself, from how he made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. For a long time, I thought that's all there was to it. Jared was just the cool guy who made everyone feel good. He was my dad's best friend, and that was that. But as I got older, I began to notice something more. Something subtle in the way he would look at me during moments when it was just the two of us. A lingering look after a casual conversation, or the way his hand would brush against mine when passing the remote or a drink. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself it was nothing, just a friendly gesture. After all, Jared wasn't that kind of guy. He was always respectful and never made me feel uncomfortable. Still, something shifted in me. I started to feel the difference when he was around, especially when my dad wasn't home. Jared never overstepped any boundaries, at least not overtly. But I couldn't ignore the way his presence affected me. He was always a little too close when we talked, always a little too interested in the details of my life, sometimes asking questions that made me wonder why he wanted to know so badly. I would catch him glancing at me, his eyes holding a moment longer than they should, and it made me wonder if he saw me differently than he did when I was younger. It made me question what I thought I knew about him. It wasn't just the small moments either. Jared had a way of making me feel important, of making me feel seen, especially when I felt invisible to others. There were nights when I felt unsure of myself, questions about my identity, who I was, and what my future would look like. Jared was one of the few people who didn't make me feel like I had to pretend. Our conversations, though simple at first, became more meaningful, more personal, with him offering advice, encouragement, and a sense of safety. I couldn't deny how much I valued his presence in my life. I never thought much of it, never questioned it too deeply. He was just Jared. But now, as I looked back, I couldn't ignore the shift. I couldn't ignore the subtle way our relationship was evolving. I was starting to notice things I hadn't before. Little comments about how I was growing up so fast or how much like my dad I was becoming. Things that could easily be written off as casual compliments but felt more significant when Jared said them. There were moments when I felt like he was more than just the trusted family friend, more than just someone I could rely on for advice. Jared's attention toward me felt different, more focused, more intentional, as if he was waiting for something to happen. It wasn't that I wanted to believe there was something more to our relationship, it was just that I couldn't deny the signs anymore. There were subtle touches that lingered a bit too long or conversations that seemed to last longer than they needed to. At first, I thought it was all in my head, that I was reading too much into his kindness, his humor, and the way he listened to me. But with each passing day, it became harder to shake the feeling that something was changing between us. I don't think I was ready for it, for what was about to happen, or for what I was about to feel. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced when he was near, or the way his voice seemed to carry more weight in my ears than it ever had before. Our friendship, once so easy and natural, was starting to feel different. And the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became to pretend I didn't notice the unspoken tension that had begun to build between us. It happened gradually. At first, I didn't even notice the shift. It was like one of those small, almost imperceptible changes in a relationship, something that grows under the surface and only becomes clear when you look back. But once I did notice, there was no ignoring it. It started small, almost innocuous, but now I can look back and see how each moment led to the next, how each fleeting glance or accidental touch was building something I wasn't ready for, something I couldn't control. The first time I felt the change was on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Jared had come over to help my dad with some work in the garage, something they did every couple of months. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when Jared came in to grab a drink. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow through the windows, and the house felt peaceful, quiet, like nothing could disrupt the calm of the day. Jared came into the living room, wiping his hands on his jeans after finishing up with the tools. His usual easygoing smile was on his face as he walked toward the fridge, but then as he leaned against the kitchen counter to open a bottle of water, he caught my eye. And for a second, there was something different in his gaze, a softness, a heat that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't the look he gave when we joked around or when he teased me. This was intimate. It made my chest tighten, my stomach flip. I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on my book, but I could feel the weight of his presence like a constant pull, dragging my attention back to him. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things, but I couldn't deny the way my pulse raced every time he was near, every time he spoke to me. The next few weeks were a blur, but now I can see how it all tied together. There were moments when our interactions became more layered, when things felt heavier than before. It wasn't just Jared being there, his usual casual self, it was something more. He would casually touch my shoulder when handing me something, his fingers brushing mine a little longer than necessary. I'd catch him staring at me more often, his eyes lingering on me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. At first, I chalked it up to my own insecurities, my own feelings changing as I started growing older, as my body and emotions began shifting. Maybe I was just becoming more sensitive, maybe Jared was just being friendly as he always had. But every time it happened, I could feel something deeper, something unspoken, that I couldn't quite place. And then there were the moments of silence, when it felt like the air between us was charged with a tension that neither of us acknowledged, but we both sensed. We'd sit next to each other on the couch, watching a game or a movie, and I would feel his presence next to me so strongly, as if there was something unsaid, something that hovered just beneath the surface of our casual conversations. I would glance over at him, and his eyes would be on me, his expression unreadable, but there was something there that I couldn't ignore. He was still Jared, still the man who had been part of my life for so long, but now there was a weight in the air when we interacted. I could see it in the way he started to notice the smallest details about me, things I hadn't thought would matter. He'd comment on how much I'd changed, how much I'd grown. There was something almost possessive in the way he would compliment me now, but it wasn't overt. It was subtle, wrapped in casual phrases that left me wondering if I was reading too much into it. One evening, a particularly memorable moment stuck with me. We were sitting outside, the evening cool and clear, the faint smell of barbecue drifting through the air. My dad had gone inside for a moment, leaving Jared and me alone on the back patio. I had been talking to him about school, nothing important, just the usual day-to-day stuff, but Jared wasn't really listening to the words I was saying. Instead, he seemed focused on me, his gaze trained on my face, his eyes searching, like he was trying to figure something out. I felt exposed under his stare, like he could see right through me. When I finished my story, I expected him to say something dismissive, something lighthearted to break the tension, but instead, he just nodded and took a long sip of his beer, his eyes never leaving me. "You're growing up fast," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I remember when you were just a little kid. So full of life. Look at you now." It was a compliment, but it struck me in a way I hadn't expected. He said it with such intensity, such rawness, as if he was seeing me in a way no one else did. His words made me feel small, vulnerable, and strangely aware of my own body. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and laughed it off, but deep down, I was shaken. There were more moments like that. In the following weeks, I noticed how my heart seemed to race whenever Jared was around. Every touch felt more charged, every word felt more loaded. It was as if we were both aware of something that had shifted between us, but neither of us were brave enough to acknowledge it aloud. In those quiet moments, when it was just Jared and me, I started to feel something I had never felt before. A longing. An intensity that I couldn't explain. Every time he looked at me, every time his hand brushed against mine, it felt like we were dancing around something, something just out of reach but too real to ignore. I wanted to push him away, to run from it, but I couldn't. I couldn't deny the way my body responded when he was near. How my breath caught every time he smiled at me in that certain way. And yet, the more I felt it, the more I pushed it down, trying to convince myself that it was just a phase, just a fleeting thing. But the truth was, I couldn't escape it anymore. I couldn't pretend that nothing was happening, that nothing was changing. Something had shifted between us, and I was caught in the middle of it. And the hardest part? I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to go back to the way things were before, to the easy, simple friendship we once had. Now, everything was complicated, every glance, every touch, every word was loaded with meaning. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending it didn't matter. The tension had been building for weeks, an unspoken weight that hung between us, heavier with every passing day. There were moments when I couldn't look Jared in the eye for too long, moments when I could feel him watching me, and it felt like something was about to crack. It was as if we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that neither of us wanted to acknowledge, yet both of us felt powerless to stop. The night it happened was like any other. My dad had gone out to visit a friend, and it was just Jared and me at home. It was late, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of crickets outside. Jared and I had been sitting in the living room, the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows across the room. We had been watching a movie, but neither of us was really paying attention. Every time I glanced at him, I felt the pull between us, a magnetic force that seemed to draw me in even though I wanted to resist it. I couldn't tell you what happened exactly, but there was a moment when everything changed. The movie was still playing, but neither of us was watching anymore. Jared was sitting on the couch, his leg pressed against mine in a way that felt deliberate, as if he was waiting for something. I could feel the heat of his body beside mine, could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of beer on his breath. His presence filled the room in a way that made it hard to breathe, hard to focus. And then, when the silence became unbearable, he spoke. "You're not the kid I used to know," he said softly, his voice low but steady. I looked up at him, unsure of how to respond. There it was, the thing that had been hanging between us for so long. The acknowledgement that something had changed, something had shifted between us, and neither of us could deny it anymore. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, my heart racing. Jared didn't look away. He seemed to be studying me, his eyes searching mine as if trying to figure out what I was feeling, what I was thinking. I felt exposed, like he could see right through me, see the confusion and the fear that had been building inside me for weeks. "You've changed," he said again, but this time, his voice had a different edge to it. It was almost a question, like he was waiting for me to confirm something that neither of us wanted to admit. "I'm not a kid anymore," I said, my throat tightening as I tried to push back the emotions rising within me. But it was too late. The words were out, and once they were spoken, they felt heavier than anything I had ever said before. Jared shifted in his seat, his hand brushing against mine in a way that made my pulse spike. It wasn't accidental this time. It was deliberate. His fingers lingered on mine for a moment too long, and when I looked at him, his expression was different. It was soft but intense, like he was fighting something inside himself. "I know," he murmured, his voice low and hoarse. I pulled my hand away quickly, feeling a sudden surge of panic. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything inside me screamed that this wasn't right, that I should stand up, walk away, and forget about the way my heart was beating too fast, forget about the way my body was reacting to his closeness. But then, as if he could read my mind, Jared leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. His hand moved to my cheek, brushing my hair back in a way that felt tender, yet charged with something else, something I couldn't name. "I didn't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely audible, but it was full of sincerity, like he was confessing something he had been holding inside for far too long. I didn't know how to respond. I was frozen in place, my body tingling with a mix of fear and desire, both at war with each other. I should have pulled away, told him to stop, but the words wouldn't come. The emotions swirling inside me were too strong, too overwhelming. Jared seemed to sense my hesitation, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy, suffocating. "I don't know what's happening," I finally whispered, my voice trembling. "But it feels wrong. It feels like we're crossing a line we can't come back from." Jared's eyes softened, and he pulled back slightly, but not enough to break the connection. His hand stayed on my cheek, his thumb gently caressing my skin as if he was trying to calm me, trying to make me understand. "I know," he said quietly. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you. And I don't know how to make sense of it. I've tried to stay away to keep my distance, but I can't anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and my breath caught in my throat. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the weight of his confession settling over me, suffocating me. I had never heard him speak like this before. Jared had always been the strong, steady figure in my life, the one who was there when I needed him, but now he was just as vulnerable as I felt. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to feel about any of this." Jared's thumb stopped moving against my skin, and his eyes flickered with a mixture of regret and longing. "I don't want to hurt you," he said softly. "I never wanted this to happen. But I can't pretend anymore. I don't want to." For a long moment, neither of us moved, the air between us thick with unsaid words, emotions we were both too afraid to express. But finally, Jared spoke again, his voice softer, almost pleading. "Tell me what you want," he said. "Tell me what you feel, because I can't do this alone anymore." I closed my eyes, my heart racing as I struggled to find the words. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I could trust myself, if I could trust him. But the truth was, I couldn't deny how I felt. It was too strong, too real to ignore. "I don't know," I whispered again. "But I feel something too." In that moment, we were both suspended in the uncertainty of it all. There was no going back, no way to undo what had been said, what had been felt. We were both standing at the edge of something, and there was no telling what would happen next. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was raw, it was real, and it was the beginning of something neither of us was prepared for. The tension between Jared and me lingered for days, an invisible thread that kept pulling us closer, even as we tried to resist it. We couldn't ignore what had been said, what had been shared. But at the same time, neither of us knew how to take the next step. The night of our confrontation, the air had been thick with raw emotion, and though we hadn't physically crossed any further boundaries, something between us had already shifted. There was no turning back from that. The next few days were a strange mix of quiet avoidance and moments of lingering eye contact, our past interactions now weighted with a new undercurrent. I found myself replaying everything in my head, the words Jared had said, his touch, the way he looked at me like he was silently begging me to understand, to accept whatever it was that was happening between us. And the truth was, I didn't know how to feel. I wasn't sure if I should pull away or if I should lean in further, trying to understand these feelings that had been buried so deep inside me for so long. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. There was no one to confide in. My dad was gone most of the time, and even if he was around, how could I explain the complex emotions that were flooding my mind? How could I explain to him that Jared, my dad's best friend, the guy who had been part of our lives for as long as I could remember, had become something more than a friend? I couldn't risk losing that connection, but at the same time, the pull I felt toward Jared was undeniable. Days passed and slowly, we fell back into our usual routine, but everything felt different. Even the simplest interactions, exchanging a few words in passing, sitting in the same room, eating dinner together, felt charged. There was a constant awareness between us, a tension that neither of us seemed willing to break. Then one evening, a few weeks later, things came to a head again. It was another quiet night. My dad was gone, and Jared and I were sitting on the porch, the warm summer air swirling around us. There was a soft breeze that carried the scent of jasmine from the garden, and the sound of distant traffic filled the background. We were sitting next to each other, not saying much, but the space between us seemed smaller now. It was almost as if the distance that had once existed had closed without either of us noticing. "Have you been okay?" Jared asked, his voice soft but steady, like he was testing the waters. I nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Yeah, I've been thinking a lot, I guess." Jared turned to me, his face serious. "About what?" It was the opening I had been waiting for. I had avoided the conversation for as long as I could, but there was no escaping it anymore. "About us," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "About what happened. And what it all means." Jared didn't immediately respond. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. The weight of everything we hadn't said hung between us again. I could see the way he was struggling too, not knowing where this was headed, unsure of what he could or should say. "I don't know how to deal with this," I admitted, my heart pounding as the words spilled out. "I don't know what any of this means. But I can't stop thinking about you, Jared. I just can't." His gaze softened at my confession, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of relief in his eyes, as if my words had freed him from the weight he'd been carrying. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't know how to deal with it either, but I can't ignore it anymore. We can't keep pretending this doesn't matter." The honesty in his voice was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but it was also liberating. For the first time, we were acknowledging it, not just the desire, but the confusion, the guilt, the fear. It was as if everything had been building toward this moment, and there was no way out now. I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say what had been lingering in the back of my mind. "What are we supposed to do now?" Jared sighed, rubbing a hand through his hair as he leaned back in his chair. "I don't know. But I think we need to figure it out. Together." I nodded, my mind racing. The path forward wasn't clear, but I wasn't as afraid of it as I had been before. What we were facing was uncharted territory, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't want to let go of what was between us. Despite the fear, despite the confusion, there was something real here. Something raw and powerful. And I wasn't ready to throw it all away. The silence between us wasn't awkward this time. It was filled with understanding, with the shared weight of our emotions. We didn't need to speak for a while. We didn't need answers right then. It felt like the beginning of something new, something we had to navigate slowly, step by step. As the night wore on, I found myself more at ease. The fear of what was to come didn't seem as overwhelming. We were on the same page now, even if we didn't know exactly what that page said yet. We both understood that there were still a lot of unanswered questions, but we were in this together. And that, at least, was a start. But as much as we both wanted to believe in a clear resolution, the truth was that there were no easy answers. There would be obstacles ahead, moments of doubt, confusion, and possibly even pain. But there was also the potential for something real, something we had both been too afraid to fully acknowledge until now. And even though the future was uncertain, I felt a flicker of hope. We didn't have to have it all figured out right away. We just needed to be honest with each other, take things one day at a time, and see where it would lead. As I stood up to head inside, Jared placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. And for the first time in weeks, I believed him. There was no clear resolution yet, no perfect answer, but we had crossed a threshold. The weight between us had shifted, and even though the road ahead was uncertain, I wasn't as scared as I had been before. I had Jared by my side, and for now, that was enough.